get an MC real quick? All right, 732-203. Rogers Transportation out of Petersburg, Tennessee. You okay? Can I get your name real quick? And the driver's going to be empty in Middleton, you say? Put it real quick so no one speaks out of your face. What's your phone number, man? That's going to get hold of you. All right, man. I put this in. I'm going to hang up with you. Try to get a hold of this booking message real quick so you can get this put in your name, all right? Thank you so much.
Hi, Praveen.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
All right. Too much Zoom, that's all.
Yeah. But this one is fun, at least.
This one is, yeah, this is engaging. Yep. We're going to convert the mass of half the mass of Earth into digital information.
Right then.
Hi, can anyone hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
I can't hear anybody
Yeah.
else, though.
Oh,
Okay. Need to fix that.
testing. 1, 2, 3.
Sorry, everyone's muted. Stephen, can you try?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Entropy.
No, I'll get there.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
There we go. Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I think we can wait for 1 more minute for more people to join, and then Dan is gonna be in charge of the, he's gonna be our moderator today. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Leila. And Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
I guess I have a bit of a preamble to this presentation, and it's related to the email that was sent, I believe, originally from Professor Gupta, and it was about the paper Principles of Tomorrow's University. I didn't read it in depth, but I skimmed it, and it's something that I think about a lot. So I've posted a link in the chat. So I'm going to use this format as a presentation. I'll share the same screen on my, I'll share the screen on this presentation, but everyone can kind of have their own copy through this. So I guess maybe, can we have like a show of hands or something for people that are using Jupyter notebooks? Okay, we've got a few hands. All right, so so of those people, has anyone started to look at Jupyter Book? Okay, so yeah, a few heads are shaking. So yeah, so I thought I only recently came across this, and I'll just share my I'll share that on my screen now. Okay, here we go. Don't want desktop. That's fine, I'll just do that. Okay. Oops. Okay, so yeah, I thought by way of an introduction, I'd just talk a little bit about that for if anyone isn't that familiar. I think that as an exploratory tool, Jupyter notebooks are wonderful for gaining intuition about systems. The ability to interact with data, to manipulate variables, especially variables that are kind of assumptions that you're maybe making preliminary guesses with. It's just really nice to kind of poke a system and see its response. This little animation here is just something I built to look at the relationship between water level at two different locations on the same stream. And so I just found that it gave me some really nice insights about how the system behaves. It's not quite a phase space up at the top, but it's basically just different pairings of parameters in 2D in the same kind of dashboard. And so in the past, I guess now, well, since last year, since a lot of courses have been moving online, I've been building a number of notebooks for some of Stephen's classes. I guess with some enthusiasm, some trepidation, mixed success. But I think where we've taken individual notebooks in the past to to kind of diversify the type of activities that we're doing to keep interest. The online medium is very difficult to maintain attention of students. I can't imagine having 4 or 5 classes all online at this point in time. But it's just another way that students can go off on their own, open up the notebooks, and then learn the kind of latest tools of computing as well. So getting some exposure to at least the Python language in our case, which I think is a good entry point. Yeah, so maybe I'll just mention the layout here. So what's really nice about this is, you have a really easy I guess, template to bring content together. So on the left-hand side, I've only got one item in this this navigation bar here, and that's sort of today's topic. But on the right-hand side, so within this introduction page, we have you know, these sort of these links here that are automatically populated based on, you know, your markdown headings, and then each one of these links in the navigation bar on the left represents a different notebook file. So I created one for today's topic, and I, you know, save it to a folder, and it's basically 2 commands to build the kind of web form of it based on the notebooks and based on the template, and then, sorry, 1 command to build those, and then 1 command to push it to GitHub pages. So the updating process is very quick. It took me a bit of time to, you know, I hadn't done this before, so it took me a bit of time to figure it out at first. But once I figured it out, I think I updated it 3 times this morning. So it is very quick, and you know, this is online, and so I think maybe Stephen, this would be a good format for the next offering of the engineering hydrology classes. So yeah, that was my preamble. And I think, again, it kind of falls in line with a lot of the ideas that are presented in that paper, as far as open, as far as open, you know, open research, open data, that sort of thing. There's one last thing I wanted to mention here. So in the publication, I went to the Berkeley Institute of Data Science 2 summers ago for a workshop, and that's where I was introduced to Binder, which is kind of what makes this possible and so easy to do online. And that was built from the IPython kernel, which I guess Fernando Perez is responsible for creating that. But I asked specifically about publication. Are there any journals? Are there any journals that are you know, accepting this format? Because I think, you know, reading a journal article and having this kind of interactive capacity would be really great. Oh, could we have? I think there's someone not on mute here. Anyways, yeah. So he offered this article, and on the link here, there's a list. I guess there was a workshop maybe last year, and there are a number of examples from you know, earth sciences of Jupyter books that cover a range of topics. So there's a lot of interesting things in there to look at. Yeah. Okay, so on to today. Very nice, very concise paper, very kind. Maybe that's why I jumped at it partially. So a very, I guess, a concise concept, but not, that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. Maybe I should say straightforward, but not simple. So I've got a brief synopsis, and then I've basically recreated the models, the 3 different models that are presented in the paper. And then I've added some questions at the end, so we can sort of take a look. What I really like about this format is, and maybe we'll do this at the end, is this button at the top here with the little rocket ship. It launches this notebook. So everyone, what I think would be really wonderful about this format, you know, we have 11 people here today. You know, if we, you know, I've set up the models so we can discuss, you know, some of the questions, some of the assumptions, and then everyone can launch their own Binder instance, or their own instance of the notebook, and we can all, you know, mess with the code and then share, you know, ideas that way. Yeah, so that is launching. I hope it launches. Okay, yeah, so it launches. So everyone should be able to do that on their own by hitting that Binder link. Yeah. So the synopsis, I guess, you know, it's a very interesting question. Computing has been advancing, you know, kind of astronomically quickly in the past 70 years. And it naturally leads to the question of what are the limits? Like how far can it go, without some kind of revolutionary advancement on a number of fronts, and to get an intuition of kind of the scale of the advancements that would have to happen. And I think that's the idea of trying to model these and trying to play with different parameters, is to get an idea of, okay, well, does 2 orders of magnitude of the the physical dimension of the memory density, does that make an effect? So yeah, so basically there are physical dimensions to memory density, and there's sort of a proposed theoretical lower bound. I don't know if that's he's not proposing it, but yes. So there's the current sort of memory density of current technology, and then there's a lower bound, which is basically the scale of an atom. And I think that has something to do with the limit to the full description of a system. It's not explicitly described in the paper, but and then there's an energy requirement. So I don't know what the current kind of limits of efficiency are, but basically what's assumed in here is that it's sort of like the lower bound as far as conservation of energy or thermodynamic lower bound. And then of course we bring in the topic from the last session, not last week, but last month, that concept of the mass energy equivalence. So the last thing is that Vopson estimates or uses a current estimate of the growth rate and says, okay, well, it's about double digits, but let's look at a wide range just to see the sort of sensitivity of what that could be. So then using those assumptions and looking at a range of year-on-year growth rates, how long until the energy requirements based on this theoretical lower bound exceed the current energy capacity or consumption of Earth? And then a little bit more abstract, but this idea of the information mass. So how long until the information mass is exceeded or exceeds the mass of the Earth in sort of that scale? And just how long until an unreasonable number is yielded by this growth? So the first is the growth model, fairly simple. So this is the total number of bits of information accumulated on the planet. And in the paper, it explicitly says that this accounts for erasing memory as well. I'm not sure exactly how that's accounted for. I guess maybe we can ask that question at the end. How would you account for that? The size of the manufacturing or the manufacturing industry, maybe. So anyways, we've basically recreated this plot is not in the paper, but we've recreated the growth rate of digital content production, or DCP, I've made it for short. So then we move to the energy model. This is just the function here. It's recreated straight from the paper. And then the information mass model. Same thing. So, so here we sort of compare the two. Yeah, so of course, the different series represent different growth rates. This is the lowest growth rate. This is the highest growth rate in both cases. And I guess, yeah, I put down a number of questions here to sort of put this into perspective for myself. These numbers don't mean that much on their own. So I guess the first question to me was, given the information, or the order of magnitude of the information mass, I guess I wondered how that compares to the sort of the hardware constraints of of mass. So, in the paper it says, the first kilogram, it talks about the first kilogram of information mass, being generated after so much time. But what is, the sort of physical constraints around that, the structures that you need in order to be able to have that 1 kilogram of information mass. I wanted to understand the relationship between those two because I guess intuitively, it's a very large ratio. So I think the mass of the other things that contain the information are much larger. And then thinking about the critical path to growth. So, we have these illustrative examples here of, okay, well, the current energy capacity of the Earth. Well, how does that compare to the the capacity that is potentially exploitable on the Earth? But I'm looking more at the slope of this curve. So at what point does a slope require, basically, doubling the current, like at what point do you have to increase every year some amount of energy or electrical capacity, that just becomes restrictive? Is that reached first, or is the exploitable energy reached first? I thought that might be an interesting question. And then the same question for area. So, given that lower bound on the memory density, at what point, to achieve the next year's marginal additional memory for digital content production, at what point does that do you have to basically like bulldoze a continent to make some kind of like a data center? That was another question, and that's something that I looked into a little bit after these questions, so we'll get to that in a minute. Then I guess the next question was, given this kind of capacity, the capacity that we're talking about after 100 or 1,000 years at whatever growth rate, what kind of problems would we be interested in, or would be possible? And I think just given the difficulty of and the complexity of some existing problems, I don't think that's really kind of in the critical path. I think there's always going to be problems that won't be able to be solved really with any computational power that we can reasonably achieve. And then thinking of limits related to computation itself. So would there be other constraints before any of these possible constraints to do with energy or available space to build data centers? How do we collect the data? How do we transmit it? How do we sense it? Are there other computational limits, basically? So I started out and I first looked at the area question. It just kind of mentioned that, okay, in the paper, the area required would reach some singularity, it said. So, well, how can we look at that? And I looked at, I made this plot. So I took the area, basically the 25 nanometers per bit that was presented in the paper. And I also took the limit that was used. So those are represented by the area of 1 bit and the area of an atom, and plugged it into the growth rates to get sort of an area. And if I can't do it here, I have to open, oh, I have Binder open, okay. So I can't do it here, but I can do it here. So just to get a first idea of say how does the growth rate compare, or how does the area change if we assume the current memory density versus the theoretical memory density. So I plotted two different series, and just based on the slopes, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. So that's one, I think, we're talking about 2 orders of magnitude difference in area density, and we're talking about a theoretical limit to to that memory density, and it really doesn't make that much of a difference as far as how much time it gives for the in terms of the growth. And then so I thought, okay, well, let's compare it to a few a few known areas, and if we take all of the Netherlands and cover it with data banks, and I've also assumed that they have the same density 100 meters high. So it's not just one layer, it's 100 meters at 25 nanometers, or 1 atom. I don't know if this is correct, but basically it's the same thing. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. The area just grows incredibly quickly. So yeah, and then Canada, and then the ocean floor being, basically 70% of the ocean is the abyssal plains or whatever, and so that's a pretty big area. Could we cover the whole ocean floor with memory? Yeah, so that's what I have. I don't know, maybe we can come back to questions, and if anyone has any points they want to bring up, or any questions they want to add. I think it'd be neat, like this is so easy to create. I think it would be kind of nice to add in extra questions, and it can be left up. I mean, I know we have a YouTube channel where we're publishing videos of these presentations. Why not have, why not add a new chapter for papers if people are into it? Okay. Thanks everybody.
Really great illustration of how thinking in the new digital age works, where you can actually directly interact and do computations to support your mental intuition. I love it.
Okay, I'm going to unshare my, thank you. Oh.
I made several notes and comments about things we could talk about.
Okay.
One thought that occurred to me was that invariably when we talk about growth, we always tend to use a logistic S-shaped curve, which he doesn't do here. In other words, he's not factoring in constraints in some sense. He's just saying, if everything continued unbounded, what would actually happen? So I'm curious about what could be done. Almost everything grows in a constrained environment, or has some kind of constraints. It'd be interesting to know what those constraints would be. One thing which I think of is forgetting. I'm not sure whether you mentioned that earlier or not. I was distracted, and I thought you said something about forgetting. There's sort of this value of memory question, which is the data versus information question, is do we really want to store data? Do we want to store information? There's this entire debate. And then there's the compression issue, which is presumably you store things in some kind of compressed format. Not clear to me if that was taken into account in his analysis. Probably not, because that requires making a whole bunch of assumptions about redundancy, rates of redundancy, and so on. And then the other thing that occurred to me was I'm actually thinking about the problem of data right now and storage. And we started out with data being recorded on tablets, and then papyrus, and then paper, and now digital. and we think of maybe two kinds of modern digital, magnetic and optical. And one of the things that I wonder about is the two issues. One is ease of access. I think you sort of alluded to that, which is there's this great science fiction story where some point in the future they have to use the amount of information has grown so large that they have to use an entire planet as the indexing system for the library, not for the storage of the data, but just storing the metadata, the indexing system related to access, to be able to figure out where the data was so that you can go and actually find it, right? But the other one I wonder about is degradation. So, stuff stored on rock, okay, we've got fossil records, but at some point the rocks break down. So there's this whole issue of how important is it to store stuff from the past, and the other is what are the sort of rates of degradation. I used to store my music on magnetic tape, but most of that's not accessible to me anymore unless I transfer it off into some kind of digital media because the magnetic tape broke down. And then there's the trade-off between archiving versus processing versus access and use. So a lot of these issues start to become relevant.
Yeah, in terms of you brought up forgetting, and it only went as far as saying that the number that was estimated for the daily content incorporates erasing memory. So, or rewriting, writing over memory. So, yeah, but that doesn't, yeah, like you said, it doesn't incorporate the sort of compression of information. Well, do we need to, keep repeating the same observations if,
right.
or storing the same observations if we have a model that can just be used to get the result?
So there's the raw data and there's the process data aspect, right? I'm highly aware of the fact that at this point, I've got so much stuff on my computer that I will probably never ever look at, but I don't want to delete. I have some sort of resistance to deletion. On the other hand, I'm aware of people, so I'm aware of how much stuff I accumulate in my house, but I'm aware of people who don't accumulate, have better habits. They don't accumulate stuff. When new stuff comes in, they throw stuff out. But it's clearly not part of our cultural paradigm right now. We're sort of on this steep, we can store it, so let's hang on to every possible little bit we can.
So can I pose a hypothetical? This is an intriguing and interesting discussion. Suppose we go back, I don't know, 2,500 years ago to the Egyptian era. And these are these hieroglyphics, and they're creating these clay tablets. And they're saying, okay, the information is going exponential. How are we going to maintain all these clay tablets? Are we going to cover the whole earth with these clay tablets? And the answer would be yes, right? And then we invented the paper and then say, okay, how many books is it going to take? And then digital age is only 100 years old, right? So the thing is, if we exponentiate this and assume that there is going to be no new technology coming through, I think that's a mistaken premise, right? I mean, I think at some point, these exponential curves are sufficient to trigger new trajectories of technologies. And so to what extent should we get bought into this argument that the author poses? I think it's a logical conclusion if nothing else changes, right?
But information density, right? I mean, the ability to pack more and more information into a smaller space.
Yeah, and communicate that, right? I mean, simple things like even mathematical equations, right? F of x is equal to x plus y. In the absence of that mnemonic, you would basically illustrate 1 + 1 is equal to 2, 1 + 2 is equal to 3, and so forth, every alternate, instead of saying, well, x + y is that. So we have come up with ways to compress and communicate and store relationships and information and so forth. So I think it's probably, so there are two aspects to this paper, the way I saw it. The first one is this whole paradigm of information energy mass equivalence. And I guess we as a group have conceded that that is correct. We are not questioning that information is physical. And so then this is the next logical thing, that if it is physical, then what happens? And I think it's trying to basically elucidate our imagination, saying, okay, this is the logical consequence if nothing else changes. And this might essentially propel us to think differently about how we should encode information, store information, use information, what does it mean, and so forth. So I think it's probably a good departure point for us to also consider those aspects.
In that context, I have a question, Praveen, which is, I get the impression that we think of the fundamental unit for information as the bit, binary 0, 1. In the context, if you're talking about advancing, do you really, I mean, can we imagine or perceive something more fundamental than a bit?
I don't know. Quantum information, I have to still figure out how that is represented, right? I mean, bit is a conceptual unit. Its representation electronically is different from in terms of 0, 1. But its representation in a quantum framework may still be much more finer than representing a bit the way we do it right now, right? But yeah, I don't know. I mean, is there a more fundamental way? I mean, there is a book I read, a slightly departure from what you're asking, but maybe worth considering, is suppose you build a windmill, right? Or a solar panel, or any thing that produces energy, for example. You're using a lot of knowledge to create something. So anything that we create as human beings is essentially taking information and casting it into something which is an object. And then that object then basically encapsulate a lot of knowledge and information. So the way we learned to build a dam or a canal came through hundreds of years of experience and knowledge and thing, and say, okay, now we can do it better and right and so forth. And that's a compression, right? I mean, that's a compression of knowledge from generations of understanding how water flows and how we manage water and so forth. So I wonder if it is worth thinking about information and knowledge in a much more broader context than bits and things like that. And what would that take shape?
But does continuous feel more fundamental to you than binary?
Binary is a representation.
Yeah,
and
it doesn't exist. Yeah.
It's a representation which has certain amount of efficiency, right? If you wanted me to think conceptually, I can't think binary, right? I mean, I think mathematically, the way we are trained to think equations and other things. Of course, when we represent it in the computer, they are in a binary form, but we would never be able to think in those terms. We have trained our computers to think. So I don't know what is fundamental, right? I mean, one is a representational issue, and the representation is almost always, so as to say, isomorphic to the way we think and manipulate information.
I guess I'm asking whether the concept of continuity is an illusion or not.
Probably, yeah, but at what fundamental level? Yeah, I mean,
Planck scale.
yeah, I mean, the more we break down, we know nature is not continuous, right? So that is the problem.
So I think there's a couple things that I was thinking related to what you just talked about. One thing that's kind of interesting and sort of incidental is, we do use binary in our computer, but isn't actually the most efficient representation of data. I think ternary actually is more efficient than binary for encoding like computer type data. So I think, you know, that even alone is a little bit interesting to think about, but I don't necessarily know if it gets at the same sort of, I think there's almost two types of information that we're talking about, and it's hard to not conflate them. Like there's information that we talk about at like a human level that's heuristic. Like I know what text means, and therefore it has some amount of information based on some encoding, but that's not necessarily the same information that the universe sees. That text is just some other arbitrary random configuration of some fundamental particles. And I guess I have a hard time necessarily believing the argument in this paper because I think the universe doesn't care about how we transform those pieces of data. I don't see it ever being a sort of a crisis of the universe that we sent too many cat videos.
Can you explain ternary? I didn't quite grab that. Why ternary is more fundamental?
I really don't remember the reason, but I remember proving this way back in a computer architecture class. So just using 0, 1, 2 instead of 0, 1 is more efficient in terms of space. And I think it's more that we just, it's easier to implement like the fundamental circuits for logic in binary than in ternary.
But I guess that's a bit tied to the current computer architectures, right? Or the hardware, like the at the electronics level. I guess if
right,
you zoom
yeah,
in to the
that's sorry.
If you zoom into fundamental quantities, I guess like spin or whatever, they tend to be binary, or maybe not all of them, but well, in the end, I guess it doesn't matter. It's just a fixed factor to convert between bits and any other unit, right? So it doesn't change anything to the exponential nature of things, like Dan showed with his ratios of what we actually physically think is realistic versus the real fundamental limits. If it's a fixed factor, that doesn't change a lot in when we reach the catastrophe. So I guess our only hope is just the economics of things, that if we really have to choose between 1 million cat videos versus solving the climate crisis, maybe we can all agree to make one mother of all cat videos, like a compilation of 10 minutes, vote democratically about it, and only store that, and then delete the rest and use that memory to do computations on climate.
Well, there is the fact that we store multiple copies of things, right? I mean, there's not just one copy, because we want ease of access, so everybody wants their own cat video, copy of the cat video. But in principle, you don't really need to have your own copy of the cat video.
So I guess there's a trade-off. So there's a trade-off between storage of information and computation and communication. So if everything is just stored once, you need a lot more communication. I'm not sure if that takes. That definitely has limits. Also physical, and I guess computation as well.
I'm also struck by the fact that we think of information theory in terms of bits as yes/no questions, right? How many yes/no questions do you have to ask? But as a human being, I tend to work in terms of yes, no, maybe, which reflects uncertainty, which yes, no doesn't, right? And so I'm wondering if an aspect of this ternary representation that Andrew was talking about is that yes, no, maybe representation, which is 3.
I guess I thought, so first of all, I feel the same way about this idea of a constant rate of growth. That it's not, it has never matched reality. However, for the current state of technology, it kind of sets a deadline. So it's as far as things exist right now, in 100 years, it's going to be a problem. And then the other question I had was, where is the bulk? Like, how does this estimate of the daily digital content production, how does that break down? Like, where's 80% of that coming from? Because if is it like remote sensing? Is it storing time series so that to produce very accurate models of things? I don't really know what any of that is. I guess I'm thinking of like, how do the data centers dedicated to like NOAA or NASA, how do they compare to Twitter or something like that? Where that's, I guess.
I guess you can make some estimate on that based on like the total megapixels that you have installed on all satellites versus all phones, and then seeing what percentage of time they're used. I think probably cameras operated on smartphones are probably generating much more information than all this remote sensing.
So I guess a lot of that is kind of expendable. I mean, you forget about everything, everything on your phone that you did, a week ago. Photos of whatever, the duck that I took a photo of last week. I forgot about it, but in terms of storing data for a significant amount of time, is that even a fraction of this daily total of things that would be worthwhile keeping, or how do you determine what's worthwhile keeping? What's useful information as far as big problems?
Yeah, and I guess so that it's probably a ratio, right? So a constant factor. So again, maybe that in exponential growth that delays things by 10 years or so, but it doesn't really matter if it's 1% or 1 in a million bits that's useful versus the total we generate now.
Going back to what Praveen said earlier, there seem to be 2 forces. One is technological capability. When paper was expensive, we made choices about what we would store, right? Not everything got stored, only things that were deemed important enough to be stored got stored. And probably we could go back now and say, oh, I wish you had stored that, but we don't have access to it because nobody stored it. So technological capability is expanding and makes it easier and easier. But the other factor is attention, right? What do we think is important to even record and then store, right?
Yeah, I guess another point there is like our sensory capabilities as humans. So part from the growth comes from the increase in resolution and fidelity of videos, for example. But I think now we've kind of reached a limit where improving resolution doesn't really make things better for us anymore. So that drive then stops. Population growth is still exponential, but at a or not anymore actually, and at least at a slower rate. And there's a limit for if we watch videos for 100% of our lives. Beyond that, you cannot grow anymore. So I guess.
Do you really think the resolution issue has gone away? I'm not so sure about that, because presumably if you go back 100 or 200 years, people would say, oh, I don't need anything in more detail. And now people store things in more detail. 100 years from now, people will say, wow, that was not enough detail.
Maybe, but I guess at least our retina has a limit on the number of pixels there. So
Sure.
Maybe, yeah, we would like to zoom some area of the picture, maybe, but yeah,
also,
in the end.
yeah, I think one of the things that we probably don't think about very well is how is the information changing culture, in the sense how we value information, right? I mean, things that were seemingly useless may become useful in certain regards, right? And we now know how to use that information. Previously, we did not. Previously, we didn't take pictures, selfies of our friends and families all the time because, well, we didn't think there was an easy way to share it with our parents or loved ones elsewhere. But now, since sharing has become very easy, just transmitting over the web, we think this is valuable, right? So I think there is an co-evolution, so as to say, for lack of a better phrase, of what information means to us and how much information we collect. And I think if we keep thinking about the old paradigm that there is only a certain amount of information that we need and we don't know how to use it, I don't think we do a very good job of thinking about these issues.
But still, I think those are not really exponential in nature. Like maybe in the beginning they were, with the number of people having access to smartphones may have grown exponentially for some time, but once it reaches saturation of the world population, that will drop. And then there's the resolution and just the amount of time we have in the day.
The attention, I was going to say, there's a saturation of attention. So after a while, I don't want more information.
So I think, I don't know if that is an appropriate question because we say we don't want more information because we don't know what to do with it. But if we knew that this is what we want, but we don't know, we don't have the time to do that, then we can create robots to do that. Right? I mean, that's where artificial intelligence and machines are coming into play, saying, hey, look, there's just too much stuff here. My brain can't handle it, but this is where I want to get to it. Just find a way to get me there. So that doesn't invalidate the need for information. It just says, okay, I'm going to find other tools to use that stuff.
Okay, but then let's say we have AI interpreting cat videos and then releasing the appropriate amount of endorphin in our bodies through a link. If we're at that point, we might just inject the endorphin anyway. Like, I think there are certain things. Yeah, so I agree with artificial intelligence making decisions for us. Yeah, I guess I agree with you.
I don't.
Even if it's just a small percentage of the current information generation that's useful for us, that's a constant factor. But then if computer intelligence grows and we can actually process the useful information, then maybe there's still a case to make for keeping exponential growth.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, because I don't doubt that the constraints get progressively relaxed. But what I do think is that the constraints impose resistance or friction, so that growth is not necessarily unbounded.
Yeah.
So the assumption of exponential growth is based on unboundedness of some kind, and my sense is that there are things that are acting against that need to be taken into account.
But I also wonder whether the exponential growth that we have seen historically is factoring in those constraints. And so, I mean, there have been constraints and other things. And if you plot that over the last 40, 50 years, we still get an exponential curve. So those constraints are factored into it. And therefore, that trajectory may, to some extent, factor these constraints already in there.
Well, let's take vegetation on the planet, right? Vegetation on the planet comes up against a hard constraint, which is the amount of land surface, amount of sunlight, amount of water, all of that. So I think it would be reasonable to argue that at one point, if you had very little vegetation, it could grow exponentially and unbounded. But I don't think that you would see that as a long-term prospect. Now you could say, okay, now I can build another planet and vegetation on that, but there's an inherent resistance. That's what I'm trying to say. And it seems to me the exponential model tends to operate under minimal constraints anyway. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not disagreeing with you that factors in some kind of constraints about the nature of the world, but I think I'm talking about much more fundamental.
Yeah, the fundamental limits. Yeah, we'll have to respect that.
I think, I mean, I would be interested to see, just for instance, I mean, because it's in the paper, they make a point of pointing out when the iPhone came out. I bet you if you plot the whatever annual or average information being generated versus percentage of the world population that has a smartphone, I bet you find something that's roughly linear. And so, I mean,
sorry, you plot what?
I think just
what?
Against like the percentage of the world's population that has a smartphone.
Against?
The average yearly information produced.
Against time. Okay.
And I think that kind of gets at what you're saying, Hoshin, about the limits. I mean, the limits are people are generating the data, and so the limit is how fast can people generate data. It's like Praveen said, when it was tablets, that rate of information generation was pretty low compared to now with smartphones and all of that.
Well, machines have the multiplier effect, right? So then the question becomes is what are the restrictions or constraints on the machine's abilities?
In terms of like things to observe, I mean, isn't it really like what are the constraints on that? It's structure in the environment, and so then it comes down to again what can be observed. We can look at cellular processes in more and more detail and find more layers of or I guess scale invariant complexity, or is that the right term to use? But I think there's a universe to be exploited there as far as observing.
Yeah, and I guess if we then keep compressing our knowledge, in the end, we don't need to store all that data, right? So in the end, the Kolmogorov complexity of the Earth, for example, would be a limit, at least for if we store it most efficiently possible. So the additional benefits of new information decrease, and we can start compressing more and more the more we know already.
But Stephen, isn't that an assumption of the limit that information is fundamentally limited? Because once upon a time we didn't know about the existence of X-rays, and then somebody discovered X-rays, and then I mean, we're constantly discovering new ways to probe the universe.
Yeah, so maybe in the end, like there's some interpretations, I think, of quantum phenomena that it's basically harnessing the power of all the parallel universes. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but in that case, there is not really a limit if we want to go into that level of detail. But still, like, if we take human decision making, then I think there's maybe some limit to what we need in terms of understanding of the universe, beyond which it doesn't help us anymore to get further. But I'm not so sure about that, actually.
There was one more question I had regarding, I think quantum computing has been brought up a few times, regarding this, the bounds on energy. I tried to look up, forecasts of or estimates of the thermal efficiency of quantum computing, and I didn't really see any agreement. Does anybody know anything about that? I mean, at least I think the best case I saw was, certainly not exponentially better, or orders of magnitude better, not even exponentially, than classical or standard computing. And some estimates said it was even worse. So I don't know. It's not an area I'm very familiar with.
So is there some kind of equivalent to the Landauer limit for quantum computers? Like the amount of heat you generate, you have to dissipate per operation, or I think per bit you forget. Yeah, I would. That's at least for classical computers. That would be a similar hard constraint, right, for processing. Like it's basically an energy flux that's related to computation.
I also have a comment and a question regarding redundancy. So let's imagine that we have reached almost the top of what we can store in terms of information. So based on energy and space limits, right? So then I'm curious about the actual nature of information, which is, I think, is the ability to transfer that information, right? So we still need to have energy to generate, store, and delete information, but also to transfer the information, because if we just store the information, is like having nothing, right? So if we want to account for an efficient way to transfer that information, is getting rid of the redundant information the actual way to improve the energy that we need to transfer the information or to store the information? Is because I think if we get rid of the redundant information, then our systems are going to become very weak or not resilient, because it doesn't have enough richness in terms of the redundancy interactions between the sources of information. So I don't know if that's something that it's feasible or not.
So I think that is tied to what Stephen's question just was, about the quantum formulation of the Landauer thing. And there's the Bekenstein bound, which is like the amount of information that can be stored in some finite, or the amount of entropy, I should say. I mean, it's, how you want to take that is up to you. Contained in a finite volume, and it's based on quantum mechanical principles. So in some sense, it seems to be physical.
Yeah. And then I guess there's, what Leila says, in the end, we need to allocate some mass to storage, some mass to the infrastructure we need to communicate, and some to computation. So the process of getting rid of redundancies helps get rid of how much we need for storage, but to do that we need computation and actually find the patterns. And then once you've compressed it, you constantly need to decompress it each time you want to use it, probably. Yeah, so it would be interesting to see if there's some kind of optimal allocation between these three things. And then I guess we also need to, if we want to be part of the equation, we need some mass for food production and maintaining our biosphere.
An interesting thought just occurred to me is, I don't know what else to call it except information bubble. By analogy with the fact that our access to the universe is limited by the speed of light. There's supposedly, presumably, parts of the universe that we will never have access to because information from those parts of the universe can never reach us because they're further away than the speed of light would permit that information to reach us. Presumably, we could imagine a future in which we live in an information bubble, where each person lives in some kind of information bubble, in the sense that restrictions on access limit how much we can, how much of the actual total information in the universe is actually reachable by me. This is not new in some sense. When we didn't have transportation and radio and so on and so forth, my information bubble might have been my community or my tribe, or how far I could travel in a day or a week or a month. But presumably this is another issue that we will have to deal with as information expands and technology races to try to keep up with the ability to access it.
I guess
go ahead.
Yeah, something else I thought of is that if we keep ourselves to this planet, then the future, like if we want to harness more energy from the sun, in the end it means that the albedo of the Earth on average has to go up. So anything we reflect back to space in low entropy radiation basically is a loss. So if we keep wanting to exploit more and more of the energy, in the end it means that the Earth will turn blacker and blacker in some way. Which means that we operate at a higher temperature, right? So in a way, climate change is unavoidable if we keep expanding. Yeah, it's basically the albedo that goes up the more, if we hit the limit of solar energy, which is in the end the only input to the Earth system.
I was going to ask about, isn't like the extent of the observable universe also decreasing? Is there like, I was watching a talk by, is it Lawrence Krauss, about there's a specific period when the cosmic background radiation is observable from here. I mean, that's
because of the expansion
kind of
of the universe.
Yeah, I don't know how that, off the top of my head, how that compares to the order of time we're talking here, but it's something. We don't have access to that information after some.
So what is the time scale that we're looking at here for this catastrophe anyway? Was it the next 100 years that I should be worried about, or
100 to 1,000, if I remember the graphs.
Yeah. The one thing about catastrophe is that we as human beings predict catastrophe and then prevent it, so it never happens. And that's the value of prediction. And that's the whole point. Unless you realize how bad it is going to get, I mean, that motivates certain challenges for it not to happen. And so I think with these kind of articulations, I'm pretty sure people will start thinking about these things and find ways to prevent that so we never realize it.
That's a very important point, Praveen. But I'm also reminded of a talk that I can't remember the guy's name now, gave at Case Western Reserve when I was getting my PhD, and he had in his I think 60 years of his career, he had spent 20 years on one subject, and then he switched to another subject, and then the last 20 years he spent on a completely different subject. So he purposely changed fields every 20 years, right? Something most people don't do. And somebody asked him what was the most interesting and important thing you learned. And he said the most important and interesting thing I learned was from ecology, which is that when a system is threatened or perturbed, its initial response is to ignore it. And it waits and waits and waits and waits until it absolutely can't ignore it anymore because something bad starts to happen. And then it reacts.
The problem, though, is that if there's delays in the response of the environment, like with climate change, then that approach to control might not work.
Yeah, I also wonder whether we have to distinguish between cognitive and non-cognitive systems to some degree, right? So human beings can basically anticipate things that may happen immediately or in the future and things like that. But ecosystems are pretty much responding to what is happening now, and maybe there is some learning associated with that, what has happened in the past in terms of adaptation. But there probably is not so much of its forecast, whereas human beings can forecast, predict, and design in a manner to cope up with it much better. The question is, do they do it sustainably or not? That's a big question as to what is it that they are valuing in their design and consideration, because it's such a powerful force. I think that's the key point.
And I guess there's also the question, like, does society as a whole act more like a human or more like an ecosystem then? Because like ecosystems learn by selection, right? So that's definitely, it must be feedback. Humans, I guess they can do computation that allows predictions. But then what are the fundamental forces in like information exchange in a society? Can we think collectively in any meaningful way, or is it more like an evolution of memes?
We do tend to be anthropomorphic in our view of the world, right? We tend to think of ourselves as the smartest. But if you use survival or some other metric as an indication, you know, are humans more, are human beings better there, or are roaches or some other organism actually better at that level? So just pointing out that we're taking a very anthropomorphic view of ecology.
Fair enough.
Yeah, regarding that, I remember seeing an episode of a show that it's called Connected. It's on Netflix, and it shows how some birds in, I think it's Georgia, they tend to migrate earlier in when the hurricane season later, it's gonna be harder. So yeah. I'm not sure if we are the only ones who can predict things that are gonna get worse.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess anything with a brain can predict to some extent.
I saw an interesting talk by somebody who pointed out the first known fossil record indicating some kind of memory intelligence structure, and it was a fossil record of a worm embedded in mud, which in the pathway of the worm in mud, and then it turned to the left and it moved some distance, and then it turned back and came back and then continued on, as the first recorded fossil record of some kind of intelligent activity involving memory.
So I guess the direction was determined to be better than purely random, the direction of motion. Or?
I assume we're making interpretations on this, but
So this point then that you had about the limits to capacity expansion of the energy production, did you have any thoughts on that, or did you make some calculation, like when the slope of this curve becomes unreasonable practically?
Yeah, I thought about what that might mean, but I guess I would imagine that maybe fusion would come along by that point. It would have to come along, and so we can just start cranking out fusion reactors, and
Yeah.
And that would be a big change.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, I'm wondering, like, would the sun then still be a meaningful constraint, or is the energy we can produce here from fusion actually? I guess you can calculate that by the mass of the sun where fusion happens as well, and then seeing what portion of the sphere at this distance from the sun, percentage-wise, the Earth occupies. You can make some back of the envelope calculation. Like, what if the mass of the Earth was used for fusion? How does that relate to the power of the sun we receive as the upper bound?
I'm
I
going to
thought you
have
were
to
going to
go.
say, is the sun irrelevant? To which I'd say, this is the first sunny day we've had in maybe, 2 or 3 weeks. So it is relevant. And on that note, yeah.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to have to go in a minute. I have a question for Praveen, whether he has a plan in some near future to share his recent thoughts in a accessible format.
Or the one
more
which I was
accessible,
working on?
Yeah. The
Yeah,
one that you just wrote the paper about. Yeah.
Yeah, I can do that maybe the next time then. So maybe 6 weeks from now. So next time you wanted to do Ocean something on that equiprobable estimation for entropy. And after that, I can do that. So maybe I'll share a copy of the paper maybe in 3 weeks, and then I'll have enough time for people to read it.
Yes, that will be on February 24th.
That's
okay. I want to thank Dan for this great presentation, and also for taking the time and the effort to making this new tool for the group. So if you could share the link with me, I can share it in the future emails. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And,
yeah.
Actually, I have a question. I have a question before we go then for Dan. Could you foresee in the future that papers published might look more like what you just shared with us?
Yes. I hope to, that one of the purposes of me reaching out to Fernando Perez was to find out, okay, is anybody accepting this format? Because I find it very intuitive. I like the interactivity. And so I mean, I think I'd like that. It's a goal for myself to try and publish something using that format.
And I could imagine that future textbooks would also look something like that.
Yeah. So I think
it's already happening.
Yeah, EarthCube just had one where you could publish Python notebooks. I just posted a link to that. So they accepted Python notebooks essentially as a publication in there. And
Sorry, that's in the presentation, the EarthCube 2020. That's at the bottom of the introduction.
Okay, yeah.
All kinds of papers in there.
Yeah, so we had one, and it's happening in there, right?
What kind of educational strategy are we going to need? Because, you know, anytime you have a new method, tool, technology, people need help to migrate to that.
Maybe requesting term papers on that, on some kind of platform.
A little class maybe on how to do it.
We have to remember that much before Python notebooks came over, Mathematica had those Mathematica notebooks, right? 20, 25 years ago. And it's the same idea, but just it was more on a proprietary software and in there. So with this recent paper that we'll talk about, when I needed to encode something, I downloaded Python, but the curve was too steep. I went into Mathematica and I could solve some of the most elementary problems very, very quickly in there as illustrations. I think for me, the Python would have been a little bit more ramp up time. But for students who are coming in now, I mean, I think Python is an essential training, much like Fortran was for some of us or C was for some of us, right? And
is Mathematica a one-time or is it a subscription?
A regular subscription license. Every year you need to renew.
And does your university subscribe or not?
Yeah. So I think the university has, through the university is much cheaper. And I don't remember what the license mechanism is, whether it is a certain number of licenses in the university to which you basically run it through. I have a standalone version on my machine. I don't know, it's 50, 70 bucks or something. I don't remember exactly, but or maybe not even that.
I feel a bit like a dinosaur when I see people using all these things. It's like,
yeah, it took me essentially 3.5 days to, I mean, I haven't done Mathematica for 15 years. So to go back and refresh everything and then encode, but I like it because mathematics, I find it more intuitive mathematical representation rather than code. So I can essentially write integrals and differentials and all that into the notebook, and then it knows how to compute all that, right? Whereas in Python, you actually have to write a code for doing that. So
I'm reading Wolfram's book about that, and I'm very convinced. I mean, it makes perfect sense that yes, it's useful to be able to code, but in some sense, you need an intuitive framework to work with where you don't necessarily have to do all the coding.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. This is great.
Thank you.